They said Captain Jessica Ghost Morgan was finished, washed up. A liability who couldn't be trusted with anything more dangerous than filing incident reports and organizing supply closets. What they didn't know was that the woman they dismissed as worthless had once executed the most classified aerial maneuver in military history. And in 18 hours, she would prove that sometimes the most broken-looking people are actually the most dangerous weapons, waiting for the right moment to strike. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of Building 47 at Edwards Air Force Base cast their familiar harsh glow across rows of gray metal desks, each one occupied by personnel whose careers had taken unexpected detours. This was where the Air Force quietly relocated officers who had become, in the bureaucratic language of performance reviews, administratively reassigned pending psychological evaluation and career restructuring. It was a polite way of saying this was where they put the broken ones. Jessica Morgan sat at desk 23B, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned to find purpose in meaningless tasks. Nameplate read J. Morgan, Administrative Specialist, a title that had replaced the call sign that had once struck fear into enemy pilots across 3 continents. At 31, she looked older than her years, her auburn hair pulled back in a regulation bun that couldn't quite hide the premature gray streaks that had appeared after her last mission. The stack of incident reports on her desk told the daily story of a major Air Force installation, minor equipment malfunctions, routine maintenance delays, personnel transfer requests, and the endless stream of paperwork that kept America's most advanced fighter wing operational. Each document required careful review, proper coding, and systematic filing in databases that most people assumed were managed by computers rather than human hands. Jessica's cubicle was positioned in the far corner of the administrative building, as far from the flight line as possible while still technically being on base. Through the small window beside her desk, she could see the distant shapes of F-22 Raptors preparing for morning training flights, their angular stealth profiles catching the California sunlight like predatory birds stretching their wings. The sight still triggered something deep in her chest, a mixture of longing and pain that she had learned to suppress through months of careful emotional discipline. The other administrative specialists who worked in Building 47 treated Jessica with the casual indifference reserved for office furniture. Linda Patterson, the supply coordinator, might ask about weekend plans during coffee breaks. Frank Rodriguez, the facilities manager, occasionally requested help with scheduling maintenance work. But for the most part, Jessica existed in a bubble of professional invisibility that suited both her psychological needs and the Air Force's desire to quietly manage a personnel problem that defied easy categorization. The morning routine never varied. Arrive at 07:00, brew coffee strong enough to cut through the mental fog that had become her constant companion, and begin processing the overnight accumulation of administrative tasks. Equipment transfer requests from maintenance crews, travel authorizations for visiting personnel, supply requisitions from various squadrons, the unglamorous foundation of military operations that most people never considered or appreciated. Jessica's supervisor, Major Patricia Caldwell, was a career administrative officer who had spent 15 years managing the paperwork side of military aviation without ever stepping foot in a cockpit. She was efficient, fair, and completely unaware that the quiet woman who processed her department's most complex logistics challenges had once been considered the most naturally gifted pilot in the history of American military aviation. To Major Caldwell, Jessica was simply another administrative specialist who happened to be unusually good at understanding technical documentation and solving procurement problems. The base's command structure barely acknowledged Jessica's existence, except as a name on personnel rosters and efficiency reports. Colonel William Hayes, the wing commander, had probably seen her face during mandatory all-hands meetings, but would have been unable to pick her out of a lineup or recall anything specific about her background. She was exactly what she appeared to be, a mid-level administrative employee who handled routine tasks with competent professionalism. But those who knew how to read the subtle signs might have noticed details that didn't quite fit the image of a typical desk clerk. The way Jessica's eyes automatically tracked aircraft movements whenever she was outside, identifying engine types and flight patterns with unconscious expertise. Her posture, even while seated at a computer terminal, maintained the precise alignment of someone trained for high-stress physical demands. The slight calluses on her hands suggested familiarity with flight controls and weapon systems rather than just computer keyboards. The scars were there too, carefully concealed beneath long sleeves and makeup, but visible to anyone who understood what to look for. A thin line along her left forearm where ejection seat restraints had cut during a high-speed bailout. Slight discoloration around her right wrist from burns sustained during an emergency landing in hostile territory. The barely perceptible tremor in her hands during thunderstorms, a neurological response to trauma that no amount of therapy had been able to completely eliminate. Jessica's apartment, off base, reflected the same deliberate ordinariness as her work persona. Generic furniture from discount stores, neutral colors chosen to avoid drawing attention, and minimal personal touches that could belong to any single woman trying to build a quiet life away from public scrutiny. But hidden in a climate-controlled storage unit across town were the artifacts of her previous existence. Flight suits bearing patches from squadrons that officially didn't exist, photographs with fellow pilots whose names remained classified, and commendations for actions that could never be publicly acknowledged. The transition to civilian-style employment had required Jessica to learn skills that had never been part of military training. How to make small talk with coworkers who had never experienced combat. How to find satisfaction in completing routine tasks that lacked the life-or-death intensity of fighter operations. How to sleep through entire nights without checking radar displays or listening for incoming alerts. How to exist in a world where her greatest achievements would forever remain secret, known only to a handful of senior officers who were bound by classification levels that exceeded most security clearances. The hardest adjustment had been the silence. In the cockpit of an F-22, every moment was filled with radio communications, sensor data, and the constant awareness of tactical situations developing at supersonic speeds. The administrative office, by contrast, was a realm of muffled conversations and clicking keyboards, where the most urgent deadline was usually measured in days rather than seconds. Sometimes the quiet was so complete that Jessica could hear her own heartbeat, counting the rhythm like she once counted the intervals between missile launches during air-to-air combat. Her choice to work at Edwards had been carefully calculated. The base was large enough for her to remain anonymous while staying connected to the world of military aviation that remained her only cultural reference point. She could see the aircraft she had once commanded, hear the language she had once spoken fluently, and maintain some thread of connection to the identity she had been forced to abandon. It was a compromise between complete isolation and the painful reintegration that traditional military career counselors insisted was necessary for psychological health. The other personnel who worked in Building 47 represented various forms of career turbulence that the Air Force preferred to handle quietly rather than through formal disciplinary actions. Officers who had made mistakes that weren't quite serious enough for court-martial, but too significant to ignore. Enlisted personnel whose psychological evaluations indicated they needed time away from operational duties. Civilians whose security clearances were under review, but whose expertise was too valuable to lose entirely. Jessica fit into this collection of misfit personnel without raising questions or attracting unwanted attention. Major Caldwell's management style was hands-off and results-oriented. which suited Jessica's need for minimal supervision and limited personal interaction. The major appreciated Jessica's ability to resolve complex administrative problems without requiring constant guidance or emotional support. She had no idea that Jessica's familiarity with military procedures came from years of mission planning and operational experience rather than administrative training courses. The base's operational tempo had been increasing steadily over the past 6 months due to rising tensions in the Pacific Theater and increased training requirements for next-generation fighter aircraft. This elevated activity level meant more paperwork flowing through the administrative offices, more complex logistics challenges, and more opportunities for Jessica to demonstrate the analytical skills she had developed during her operational career. But those capabilities remained carefully hidden behind her facade of competent mediocrity. Jessica's knowledge of aircraft systems, flight operations, and military logistics was encyclopedic, but she was careful to reveal only enough expertise to complete her assigned tasks without raising questions about how a civilian administrative specialist had acquired such detailed technical knowledge. She could have streamlined numerous base operations, identified efficiency improvements, and solved problems that had been frustrating commanders for months. But doing so would have attracted exactly the kind of attention she had worked so hard to avoid. During lunch breaks, Jessica would often eat alone while reading technical manuals or aviation magazines, content to blend into the background of military life without participating in the social dynamics that defined most workplace relationships. Her colleagues viewed this behavior as evidence of social awkwardness rather than deliberate strategy. They had no way of knowing that the woman who seemed uncomfortable in casual conversation had once briefed generals on classified operations and coordinated with foreign intelligence services during joint military exercises. The irony of her situation was not lost on Jessica. She now processed maintenance reports for the same type of aircraft she had once pushed to their absolute performance limits in combat situations. Her fingers would trace technical specifications on work orders while remembering the physical sensation of pulling 8 Gs during combat maneuvers or the mental calculations required for beyond visual range missile engagements. She understood the capabilities and limitations of every aircraft on the base better than most of the pilots who flew them. But that knowledge remained locked away behind her carefully maintained administrative persona. Occasionally, particularly during periods of high operational activity or when dealing with complex technical problems, Jessica would catch herself analyzing situations with the tactical mindset that had once made her a legend among test pilots and combat aviators. She would identify potential safety issues with the instinctive pattern recognition that had kept her alive during experimental flight programs. She would notice operational inefficiencies with the strategic thinking that had revolutionized Air Force training protocols. But those moments were quickly suppressed before anyone could observe the transformation from administrative clerk to military strategist. The weather that morning was typical for the Mojave Desert in October, clear skies with unlimited visibility. That provided perfect conditions for flight operations. Through her window, Jessica could see ground crews preparing F-22s for the day's training missions, their practiced movements triggering memories of pre-flight procedures she had once performed with religious dedication. The sight of pilots walking toward their aircraft in full flight, jeers still caused a physical reaction that she had learned to control through breathing exercises and mental discipline techniques developed during her therapy sessions. What Jessica didn't know was that in less than 18 hours, a catastrophic system failure would transform one of those routine training flights into a life-or-death emergency that would test every skill she had ever developed. The administrative specialist who had learned to hide her extraordinary capabilities would be faced with a choice between maintaining her anonymity and preventing a disaster that could claim hundreds of lives. The broken pilot who had been dismissed as worthless would discover that some battles can only be won by those who have learned to fight from the shadows, and that the most dangerous weapons are often the ones that everyone assumes are safely locked away. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning briefing room in Building 47 smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, its beige walls adorned with motivational posters that seemed more like cruel jokes to the assembled personnel. Major Patricia Caldwell stood at the front of the room, clipboard in hand, addressing the 12 administrative specialists who comprised her department with the practiced efficiency of someone who had delivered the same speech hundreds of times. Today's priorities include processing the quarterly equipment readiness reports, updating personnel files for the incoming pilot rotation, and completing the backlog of maintenance authorization forms, Major Caldwell announced, her voice carrying the mechanical precision that characterized most interactions in Building 47. Remember, accuracy is more important than speed. We're the backbone that keeps this base operational, even if nobody else seems to remember that. Jessica sat in the back row, her notebook open, but her attention divided between the Major's words and the sound of F-22 engines spinning up for morning operations. Through the thin walls of the building, she could hear the distinctive whine of Pratt & Whitney F-119 turbofan engines reaching military power settings, a sound that still triggered muscle memory of pre-flight procedures she had once performed. With religious dedication, the other personnel in the briefing represented various stages of career disappointment and administrative exile. Captain Robert Chun, a former logistics officer whose security clearance had been suspended pending investigation of his gambling debts. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, an intelligence analyst whose panic attacks had made her unsuitable for operational assignments. Lieutenant Colonel David Burke, a former squadron commander whose drinking problem had been quietly managed through reassignment rather than court-martial. Each person in the room carried their own story of how they had ended up in the administrative purgatory of Building 47, but Jessica's background remained a mystery even to her closest colleagues. While others discussed their previous assignments during coffee breaks or complained about the circumstances that had led to their current positions, Jessica maintained a careful silence about her past that most people interpreted as embarrassment rather than security necessity. Morgan, Major Caldwell's voice cut through Jessica's thoughts. You'll be handling the F-22 squadron maintenance reports today. I know you've been working mostly with support equipment, but we need someone with attention to detail on the fighter aircraft documentation. Think you can handle that? The question contained an undertone that Jessica had learned to recognize in her supervisor's voice, a subtle test of competence mixed with barely concealed doubt about her capabilities. Major Caldwell had never served in an operational capacity, but she possessed the bureaucratic instincts that allowed her to identify personnel who might be more capable than their current position suggested. Jessica's consistent ability to resolve complex administrative problems had begun to attract unwanted attention. "Yes, ma'am," Jessica replied, her voice carefully modulated to convey competence without enthusiasm. "I'm familiar with the documentation requirements for fighter aircraft maintenance." The truth was that Jessica could have written the maintenance protocols from memory, having spent countless hours working with ground crews during her operational career. She understood not just the paperwork requirements, but the underlying technical systems that made the documentation necessary. Her knowledge of F-22 systems was so comprehensive that she could have diagnosed mechanical problems by reading maintenance reports alone. But revealing such expertise would have shattered the careful anonymity she had worked so hard to maintain. After the briefing, Jessica made her way to her desk and logged into the base's maintenance tracking system. The interface was familiar. She had used similar systems during her operational career, but she was careful to navigate the menus with the deliberate slowness of someone learning the procedures for the first time. The F-22 squadron's maintenance reports painted a picture of an elite, flying unit operating at the edge of their aircraft's capabilities, pushing the boundaries of what was considered safe and practical in pursuit of tactical excellence. Flight hours were accumulating faster than planned, putting stress on engines and airframes that had been designed for specific operational parameters. Component failures were occurring at rates that suggested either manufacturing defects or usage patterns that exceeded design specifications. Training scenarios were becoming increasingly complex, requiring aircraft performance that pushed pilots and machines to their absolute limits. Jessica recognized the patterns immediately. The squadron was preparing for something beyond routine training exercises. The flight profiles indicated preparation for high-stress combat scenarios involving multiple aircraft, extended range operations, and weapons systems integration that suggested real-world deployment was imminent. But officially, she was just an administrative specialist processing routine paperwork without understanding its broader implications. Her analysis was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Mitchell Reynolds, the F-22 squadron's assistant operations officer. Reynolds was everything that Jessica had once been: confident, sharp, and carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone who spent his days commanding multi-million-dollar weapons systems. He approached her desk with the casual authority of an operational pilot dealing with administrative support personnel. "Ma'am, I need to expedite a maintenance waiver for aircraft 054086, Reynolds said, placing a thick folder on Jessica's desk. "We've got a hydraulic system anomaly that's technically within acceptable parameters, but the paperwork is holding up mission-critical training. Can you push this through the system today?" Jessica opened the folder and scanned the technical documentation with the speed of someone who could read engineering diagrams like newspaper articles. The hydraulic system in question was experiencing pressure fluctuations that were indeed within manufacturer's specifications, but the pattern of variation suggested an impending failure that could occur without warning during high-stress maneuvering. The maintenance waiver would allow the aircraft to continue flying, but anyone with real understanding of F-22 systems would recognize the risk being accepted. "Captain, I noticed the pressure readings show a progressive degradation pattern," Jessica said carefully, pointing to specific data points in the report. "The fluctuations might be within specs now, but the trend suggests potential failure during high-G maneuvers. Are you sure you want to waive the maintenance requirement?" Reynolds stared at her for a moment, his expression shifting from casual dismissal to sharp attention. "How exactly would you know about F-22 hydraulic system behavior patterns?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "That's pretty detailed technical knowledge for an administrative specialist." Jessica felt the familiar chill of exposure, the moment when her carefully constructed facade threatened to crack under scrutiny. She had made the mistake of revealing expertise that couldn't be explained by her official position, and now she needed to deflect suspicion without appearing evasive or incompetent. "I've been processing these reports for several months," she replied, maintaining steady eye contact while carefully controlling her voice. "You start to notice patterns in the data when you're looking at maintenance issues every day. But you're the pilot. You understand the operational requirements better than I do." The deflection worked, but Jessica could see that Reynolds remained suspicious. Operational pilots developed instincts about people that went beyond official credentials and job descriptions. They learned to recognize competence and expertise regardless of rank or position, and something about Jessica's response had triggered his professional paranoia. "Right," Reynolds said slowly, taking back the folder. "I'll have the squadron maintenance officer review the data again before we submit the waiver request. Thanks for your ... attention to detail." After Reynolds left, Jessica sat quietly at her desk, understanding that she had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Her comment about hydraulic system behavior had revealed knowledge that no administrative specialist should possess, and it was only a matter of time before word of the interaction reached people who might ask uncomfortable questions about her background. The remainder of the morning passed without incident, but Jessica could feel the subtle shift in how other personnel interacted with her. Word traveled quickly through military installations, and the story of an administrative clerk who understood F-22 hydraulic systems would inevitably reach ears that might connect such knowledge to classified personnel records. During lunch break, Jessica walked to the base perimeter fence, where she could watch aircraft operations without attracting attention. The F-22s were conducting air-to-air combat training, their movements displaying the lethal grace that had made them the world's most advanced fighter aircraft. She could identify individual pilots by their flying styles, recognize specific tactical maneuvers by their execution, and predict the outcome of engagements based on positioning and energy management principles that she had once taught to other aviators standing at the fence. Jessica allowed herself a moment of pure nostalgia for the life she had abandoned. The physical sensation of pulling Gs during combat maneuvers, the mental challenge of tracking multiple targets while managing weapon systems, the absolute clarity of purpose that came from flying the most advanced aircraft ever built in defense of national security. It had been the only existence that had ever made complete sense to her, and losing it had left a void that no amount of therapy or administrative work could fill. Her reflection was interrupted by the arrival of Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, one of her colleagues from Building 47. Santos had been struggling with anxiety issues that had ended her career in intelligence analysis, and she often sought out Jessica during breaks because she found her presence calming. "Hey Jessica," Santos said, joining her at the fence. "Watching the show? Sometimes I think those pilots don't realize how lucky they are. Flying those machines must be like touching the face of God." Jessica smiled, recognizing the religious metaphor that many people use to describe experiences beyond normal human comprehension. "It probably takes incredible skill and training," she replied carefully. "I imagine most of us could never handle that kind of responsibility." The comment was true enough, but Jessica knew that Santos would never suspect she was talking to someone who had once been considered the most naturally gifted pilot in the history of military aviation. The conversation continued with Santos, sharing her struggles with anxiety and her hopes of eventually returning to operational duties, while Jessica listened with the patience of someone who understood the psychological cost of military service. They returned to Building 47. Jessica found a message waiting on her desk from Major Caldwell requesting a meeting in her office. The summons carried no explanation, but Jessica understood that her interaction with Captain Reynolds had likely triggered administrative scrutiny that could threaten her carefully maintained anonymity. Major Caldwell's office was a study in military bureaucracy, with filing cabinets, regulation binders, and motivational plaques creating an environment that emphasized procedure over creativity. The Major gestured for Jessica to take a seat while she reviewed what appeared to be personnel files and efficiency reports. "Jessica, I've been reviewing your work performance over the past several months," Major Caldwell began, her tone suggesting this was not entirely a positive conversation. "Your technical knowledge and problem-solving abilities are exceptional, probably the best I've seen in 15 years of administrative management. But I'm getting questions from operational personnel about how a civilian administrative specialist knows so much about aircraft systems." Jessica had anticipated this moment since her arrival at Edwards, understanding that her expertise would eventually become visible despite her efforts to remain invisible. Her response had been carefully prepared through months of psychological preparation and strategic planning. "Ma'am, I've always been interested in aviation," Jessica said, delivering the cover story she had rehearsed countless times. "Before coming to work here, I spent a lot of time reading technical manuals and studying aircraft systems as a hobby. When you're processing maintenance reports every day, you start to understand how the systems work together." Major Caldwell studied Jessica's face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. "That's quite a hobby," she said finally. "Most people who understand F-22 hydraulic systems the way Captain Reynolds described have either engineering degrees or flight experience. You wouldn't happen to have any background in aviation. That's not in your personnel file, would you?" The question hung in the air like an unexploded bomb, carrying implications that could destroy everything Jessica had worked to build. Her answer would determine whether she could continue her quiet existence in administrative exile, or whether her true identity would be exposed to people who might not understand the psychological necessity of her current position. "No, ma'am," Jessica replied, meeting Major Caldwell's gaze with the steady calm that had once unnerved enemy pilots across hostile airspace. "Just a civilian with an unusual hobby and attention to detail. I understand if my knowledge level seems inappropriate for my position. I can try to be less analytical in my responses to technical questions." Major Caldwell continued studying Jessica for several more seconds before nodding slowly. "I appreciate your honesty, and I'm not suggesting you tone down your capabilities. Your work performance is exemplary. But be aware that exceptional competence sometimes attracts unwanted attention in military environments. People start asking questions when someone knows more than they're supposed to know." The warning was clear enough, and Jessica understood that her supervisor was trying to protect her from scrutiny that could become dangerous for reasons that Major Caldwell couldn't possibly comprehend. The irony was that the woman trying to shield her from attention had no idea that the person she was protecting had once been the most classified pilot in American military history. As Jessica returned to her desk, she realized that her carefully constructed world of anonymity and routine was beginning to fracture. The encounter with Captain Reynolds had been a mistake that couldn't be undone, and the questions it had generated would inevitably lead to more scrutiny from people who might have access to classified personnel records. Her time in administrative exile was running out, whether she was ready for exposure or not. The afternoon passed quietly, but Jessica could feel the weight of impending change pressing against the boundaries of her controlled existence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities for the kind of mistakes that could shatter the protective anonymity she had worked so hard to maintain. But what she didn't know was that in less than 12 hours, a crisis would emerge that would make her previous concerns about exposure seem trivial compared to the life or death decisions she would be forced to make. The classified personnel file buried deep within Pentagon databases told a story that would have rewritten the history of American military aviation if it had ever been declassified. Captain Jessica Ghost Morgan's true background began 8 years earlier in the cockpit of an experimental F-22 variant, screaming through the stratosphere at Mach 2.8 while testing flight envelope parameters that pushed both human and machine beyond previously known limitations. The Nighthawk program had been so classified that even its existence was compartmentalized across multiple agencies, with only 17 people in the entire government possessing complete knowledge of its scope and objectives. Jessica had been selected from over 3,000 applicants across all military services, chosen not just for her exceptional flying skills, but for psychological traits that appeared perhaps once in a generation among military aviators. The selection process had been designed by psychologists who specialized in identifying individuals capable of operating effectively in situations that would break most people. 6 months of testing had evaluated everything from reaction times under extreme stress to decision-making capabilities during simulated life or death scenarios. Jessica had emerged from the program with performance scores that exceeded the metrics used to design the tests themselves. Her instructors had been legendary, pilots whose names would never appear in aviation history books, men and women whose achievements had shaped the development of American air power through decades of classified operations. They had recognized in Jessica a combination of technical brilliance, tactical intuition, and psychological resilience that represented the evolution of military aviation itself. The F-22 variant she had been assigned to test existed nowhere in official records. Designated only as Project Aurora, the aircraft incorporated experimental systems that pushed stealth technology, supersonic cruise capability, and weapons integration decades beyond anything in operational service. The test program required pilots who could evaluate systems that didn't exist in manuals, execute maneuvers that violated conventional wisdom, and provide feedback on capabilities that redefined the boundaries of aerial warfare. Jessica's call sign, Ghost, had been earned during a training exercise that became legendary within the classified aviation community. She had been tasked with penetrating a layered air defense network, using only experimental stealth systems and unconventional flight profiles. The exercise controllers had expected her to demonstrate the aircraft's capabilities while following established test procedures and safety protocols. Instead, Jessica had disappeared from all tracking systems for 43 minutes, during which time she had systematically identified and cataloged every component of the defense network, including classified installations that weren't supposed to be part of the exercise. When she finally reappeared on radar, she was behind the control tower at the test facility, having completed a flight profile that seemed to violate the laws of physics, while gathering intelligence that impressed even the most experienced test pilots. The classified missions that followed had taken Jessica to contested airspace above 3 continents, always flying alone in aircraft that officially didn't exist, conducting operations that were denied by government officials who had personally authorized them. She had provided reconnaissance support for special operations forces in denied territory, conducted electronic warfare missions against hostile air defense networks, and tested experimental weapon systems under combat conditions that couldn't be replicated in laboratory environments. Her most significant achievement, classified under a code name that remained unknown even to most Pentagon officials, had involved the single-handed neutralization of an entire enemy air defense network, protecting a facility developing weapons of mass destruction. Jessica had penetrated airspace that was considered impenetrable, using flight techniques that combined experimental stealth technology with aerobatic maneuvers that pushed human tolerance beyond documented limits. The operation had required her to fly for 96 minutes in hostile territory while avoiding surface-to-air missiles, interceptor aircraft, and electronic jamming systems that had been specifically designed to counter American stealth technology. Her success had prevented a regional conflict that could have escalated into global warfare, but the mission's existence was so sensitive that even its outcomes were classified at levels that restricted access to fewer than a dozen individuals. Jessica's combat record during the Nighthawk program was unprecedented in military aviation history. She had flown over 400 test missions, evaluated experimental systems that represented billions of dollars in research and development, and provided technical feedback that influenced the design of aircraft that wouldn't enter service for decades. Her innovations in flight technique, systems integration, and tactical employment had been incorporated into training programs throughout the Air Force. Though her identity as their creator remained classified, the psychological profiles contained within her classified files revealed a pilot who thrived in environments that would have been psychologically devastating to most people. Her ability to remain focused during extreme stress, to make complex decisions with incomplete information, and to execute precise maneuvers while managing multiple crisis scenarios simultaneously had been documented through extensive testing and real-world evaluation. That her technical knowledge extended far beyond conventional pilot training. Jessica had studied aeronautical engineering, advanced physics, and computer science with the same intensity that she applied to flight operations. She could redesign aircraft systems to achieve performance characteristics that exceeded manufacturer specifications, develop new tactical procedures through mathematical analysis of aerodynamic principles, and troubleshoot complex mechanical problems using only sensory input and theoretical knowledge. The awards and commendations in Jessica's classified files told the story of achievements that could never be publicly acknowledged. She had received the Medal of Honor twice, the Distinguished Flying Cross 7 times, and commendations from foreign governments whose names were redacted from even classified documents. Her Purple Heart had been earned during a mission over hostile territory when she had successfully completed her objectives despite aircraft damage that should have made survival impossible. But Jessica's file also contained darker entries that documented the psychological cost of operating in complete secrecy while carrying responsibilities that affected global security. Medical reports described symptoms of post-traumatic stress, social isolation, and emotional detachment that had developed gradually as her classified career progressed. Psychological evaluations noted her increasing difficulty relating to people who hadn't experienced similar levels of stress and responsibility. The breaking point had come during a mission that officially never occurred, involving an experimental aircraft that didn't exist, conducted over territory that couldn't be acknowledged. Jessica had been ordered to intercept a hijacked commercial airliner that intelligence sources believed was being used to transport stolen nuclear materials to a terrorist organization. The aircraft contained 287 passengers and crew members who were unaware of the cargo being transported in their aircraft's modified cargo hold. For 2 hours and 14 minutes, Jessica had flown in formation with the hijacked airliner while ground controllers evaluated options for preventing the nuclear materials from reaching their destination. Her experimental F-22 variant was equipped with weapon systems that could have destroyed the commercial aircraft instantly, but the loss of innocent lives was considered acceptable only if all other options were exhausted. The psychological pressure of those 134 minutes had been documented through real-time physiological monitoring and post-mission evaluation. Jessica had maintained perfect flight discipline while watching civilian passengers through the airliner's windows, knowing that her orders might require her to kill them to prevent a greater catastrophe. She had been in constant communication with intelligence analysts, military commanders, and government officials who were debating the value of 287 individual lives against potential nuclear terrorism. The crisis had ended when Special Operations Forces had successfully boarded the aircraft during a refueling stop, eliminating the hijackers and securing the nuclear materials without casualties. But the psychological evaluation following the mission had revealed that Jessica's capacity for continued service in classified programs had been fundamentally compromised by the moral complexity of the decisions she had been prepared to make. Her request to leave the Nighthawk program had triggered a crisis within the Pentagon's most sensitive aviation projects. Jessica's skills were considered irreplaceable, her knowledge invaluable, and her loss to classified operations potentially catastrophic to national security. She had been offered promotions that would have made her the youngest colonel in Air Force history, assignments that would have given her command of programs affecting the future of American military aviation, and compensation packages that reflected her unique value to national defense. But Jessica's decision had been absolute. The psychological evaluation reports documented her complete emotional exhaustion, her inability to continue making decisions that affected hundreds of thousands of lives, and her desperate need for existence that didn't require carrying the weight of classified knowledge that could never be shared or acknowledged. The solution had been negotiated through a complex arrangement involving the Central Intelligence Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and psychological warfare specialists, whose names appeared on no official organizational charts. Jessica's knowledge made her a permanent security risk, but her service record and psychological profile indicated that she could be trusted to maintain the secrecy that her former missions required. Her assignment to Edwards Air Force Base as A civilian administrative employee had been designed to provide her with meaningful work, while keeping her within a controlled environment where her activities could be monitored. The position allowed her to remain connected to military aviation while removing her from the classified responsibilities that had broken her. Psychological resistance. Jessica's apartment contained none of the traditional military memorabilia that might have indicated her background. No photographs of aircraft or fellow pilots, no display cases filled with medals and ribbons, no maps marking the locations of her various deployments. The space had been deliberately designed to suggest the life of someone who had never been anything more than a civilian government employee, but hidden in a specially constructed safe built into the apartment's foundation were the artifacts of her true identity. Flight logs detailing missions that remained classified at the highest levels, photographs of aircraft that officially didn't exist, and technical manuals for weapon systems that were still considered theoretical. Her experimental flight suit hung in a climate-controlled container, its patches and insignia bearing witness to achievements that could never be publicly recognized. The most significant item in the safe was a single photograph taken during her final mission briefing. Jessica stood alongside the other pilots of the Nighthawk program, their faces young and confident, their expressions reflecting the shared understanding that they had participated in something that would never be acknowledged, but had shaped the course of history. Of the 17 pilots in the photograph, 9 had died in experimental aircraft that officially didn't exist. 4 had been permanently disabled during test flights that never appeared in accident reports, and 3 had disappeared during classified missions that were never investigated. Jessica was the only member of the program who had survived with her physical and mental capabilities intact, but the cost had been measured in ways that conventional military medicine could barely understand. Her medical records, sealed under classification levels that exceeded most security clearances, documented injuries that would have ended the careers of conventional pilots and psychological trauma that had required innovative treatment approaches developed specifically for classified personnel. The psychiatric evaluations in her file revealed a complex personality shaped by experiences that existed outside normal human reference points. Jessica had learned to compartmentalize information that could affect global security, to make decisions under pressure that most people couldn't comprehend, and to maintain operational effectiveness while carrying knowledge that isolated her from conventional relationships. Her transition to civilian life had been complicated by the fact that her achievements couldn't be acknowledged, her expertise couldn't be utilized, and her experiences couldn't be shared with anyone who lacked similar security clearances. The identity she had been forced to construct was not just a cover story, but a psychological necessity that allowed her to function in a world where her true capabilities had to remain hidden. The harassment and dismissal she now experienced from people like Captain Reynolds were particularly painful because they came from fellow aviators who would have recognized her achievements if they had been allowed to know about them. The irony of being considered worthless by people whose lives she had protected through classified operations was a daily reminder of the price she had paid for serving her country in complete secrecy. Jessica's commitment to her civilian identity was absolute, but it was maintained through constant psychological effort that required her to suppress instincts and knowledge that had once defined her existence. Every day brought situations where her expertise could have solved problems or prevented accidents, but revealing such capabilities would have destroyed the anonymity that had become essential to her psychological survival. What the people around her didn't understand was that their dismissal and condescension was being absorbed by someone who had once been considered the most dangerous pilot in the history of American military aviation. Her patience with their ignorance was not weakness, but the same emotional control that had allowed her to complete missions that others had considered impossible. The desk clerk they saw as worthless was actually a weapon of unprecedented capability, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer serve the greater good. Colonel Thomas Brennan commanded the 412th Test Wing at Edwards Air Force Base with the iron discipline of someone who had built his career on the belief that military excellence required absolute adherence to hierarchy and traditional values. At 48, his silver hair was cut to regulation precision, his uniform pressed to razor-sharp creases, and his bearing reflected the unwavering confidence of a man who had never questioned the fundamental assumptions that had carried him through 26 years of military service. Brennan's corner office in the wing headquarters overlooked the vast expanse of Edwards Flight Line, where billions of dollars worth of experimental aircraft represented the cutting edge of American military technology. The walls of his office displayed photographs from various assignments and training exercises, but careful examination would reveal that most documented administrative achievements rather than operational accomplishments. His career had been built in staff positions, procurement offices, and training commands, environments where political skill mattered more than combat experience. The colonel's management philosophy was rooted in the conviction that military effectiveness depended on maintaining clear distinctions between military personnel and civilian support staff. He viewed the increasing integration of civilian contractors and government employees as a dangerous erosion of military culture that threatened the warrior ethos he believed was essential to American defense capabilities. In his mind, civilians could never truly understand the responsibilities and sacrifices that defined military service. Jessica Morgan had first attracted Colonel Brennan's attention during a routine review of administrative efficiency reports. Her name appeared frequently in connection with resolved technical problems and streamlined logistics processes, but rather than appreciating her contributions, Brennan had begun to view her competence as evidence of inappropriate boundary crossing between civilian and military spheres of responsibility. Miss Morgan seems to have opinions about everything from aircraft maintenance to flight safety protocols, Brennan had remarked to his deputy commander during a staff meeting. I find it concerning when civilian employees start acting like they understand military operations better than the people who've dedicated their lives to military service. The colonel's suspicion had been reinforced by reports from Captain Reynolds about Jessica's unusual technical knowledge and her ability to identify potential problems in maintenance documentation. Rather than recognizing her expertise as valuable, Brennan interpreted it as evidence of civilian overreach that needed to be corrected through proper command authority. His campaign against Jessica began subtly, through administrative channels that were designed to limit her access to information and reduce her involvement in technical decision-making. New procedures were implemented that required military personnel to review all civilian recommendations before they could be acted upon. Jessica's access to certain databases was restricted under revised security protocols that seemed to affect only her position. The colonel's approach was systematic and carefully documented, designed to appear as legitimate management decisions rather than targeted harassment. He understood that direct confrontation with a civilian employee could create legal complications, but administrative pressure applied through proper channels could achieve the same objectives while maintaining the appearance of professional leadership. Jessica recognized the patterns immediately. During her classified career, she had observed similar tactics used against personnel who threatened established power structures or challenged conventional thinking. But her response was characteristic of the discipline that had once made her legendary among test pilots. She absorbed the restrictions without complaint and continued performing her duties with the same precision that had characterized her experimental flight operations. The colonel's confidence in his approach was bolstered by the apparent success of his initial measures. Jessica's involvement in complex technical issues decreased. Her recommendations were filtered through multiple layers of military review, and her visibility within the wing's operations was significantly reduced. To Brennan, this represented proper restoration of military hierarchy and civilian boundaries. But what Colonel Brennan didn't understand was that he was systematically antagonizing someone whose actual capabilities exceeded anything in his experience or imagination. Every restriction he imposed was being documented by a mind trained in intelligence analysis and strategic planning. Every slight was being cataloged by someone who had once provided direct counsel to Pentagon officials on matters affecting national security. The escalation began during the quarterly readiness exercise, a complex operation that tested the wing's ability to respond to various crisis scenarios. Jessica's previous involvement in such exercises had been limited to routine administrative support, but her expertise in aircraft systems and operational procedures had made her an unofficial resource for solving logistics problems that confused military personnel with less technical knowledge. Under Colonel Brennan's new restrictions, Jessica's role was reduced to basic data entry and routine clerical tasks. The colonel made a point of visiting the administrative offices during the most intense phases of the exercise, when the importance of efficient coordination was most critical and the value of technical expertise was most obvious. "Working hard, Miss Morgan?" Colonel Brennan asked during one of his tours, his tone carrying the condescending edge that had become characteristic of their interactions. "I hope you're not taking on responsibilities that exceed your authority. We wouldn't want any confusion about roles during such a critical operation." Jessica looked up from her computer terminal, meeting his gaze with the steady composure that had once unnerved enemy pilots in hostile airspace. "Just completing my assigned task, sir. Making sure the paperwork supports the mission." The colonel's smile was thin and calculating. "Paperwork? Yes, that's exactly right. That's what civilian employees do. They handle paperwork. It's important work, of course, but it's not the same as actual military responsibility." "I'm glad we understand each other." The exchange was witnessed by several military personnel who were working nearby, and their reactions revealed growing discomfort with the colonel's treatment of Jessica. Some avoided eye contact, unwilling to challenge their commander but uncomfortable with the obvious unfairness. Others watched with barely concealed disapproval, recognizing that something fundamental was wrong with the situation. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the wing's deputy operations officer, had been observing these interactions with increasing concern. Mitchell was a combat veteran who had flown F-16s in Iraq and Afghanistan, and she possessed the kind of operational experience that allowed her to recognize competence regardless of rank or position. Her attempts to moderate Colonel Brennan's approach had been met with subtle but unmistakable warnings about the importance of supporting command decisions. "Sir, I think Miss Morgan's technical knowledge could be valuable during complex operations," Mitchell had suggested during a private meeting. "Her ability to spot potential problems in maintenance documentation has prevented several issues that could have affected flight safety." Brennan's response had been swift and decisive. "Colonel Mitchell, I appreciate your concern for efficiency, but we must maintain proper boundaries between military and civilian responsibilities. Miss Morgan is a competent administrative employee, but we can't allow civilian personnel to start making decisions that belong to military professionals." The colonel's fixation on Jessica had begun to affect the wing's operational effectiveness in ways that he was either unwilling or unable to recognize. Technical problems that she could have identified and resolved were being assigned to military personnel who lacked her expertise, resulting in delays and inefficiencies that cascaded through the wing's operations. Her insights into aircraft systems and maintenance procedures were being lost, because acknowledging their value would have undermined Brennan's philosophy about civilian limitations. Jessica's isolation within the administrative structure was becoming increasingly complete. Her colleagues had learned to avoid associating with her too closely, understanding that Colonel Brennan's disapproval could affect their own career prospects. The informal networks of communication and cooperation that made military organizations function effectively were being systematically disrupted by the colonel's campaign to marginalize her contributions. The psychological pressure was intensified. by Jessica's knowledge that she could have solved many of the problems that were frustrating the wing's operations. Her expertise in experimental aircraft, advanced systems integration, and complex logistics coordination was exactly what was needed to address the challenges facing Edwards' test programs. But revealing such capabilities would have destroyed the anonymity that had become essential to her psychological survival. During a particularly complex test flight evaluation, Jessica watched from her restricted position in the administrative offices as military personnel struggled with technical analysis that she could have completed in minutes. The aircraft in question had exhibited unusual flight characteristics during high-altitude testing, and the engineering team was having difficulty interpreting the data patterns that would explain the anomalies. From her desk, Jessica could see the flight test data displayed on computer screens throughout the operations center. The patterns were immediately recognizable to someone with her background. The aircraft was experiencing a specific type of aerodynamic instability that could be corrected through minor adjustments to control surface programming. The solution was elegant and straightforward, but the engineering team was pursuing more complex explanations that would delay the test program by weeks. Her frustration was compounded by the knowledge that the delay would affect operational readiness for squadrons that were scheduled to receive the modified aircraft. Pilots who depended on these systems for mission success would be forced to operate with suboptimal equipment because the people responsible for analysis lacked the expertise to recognize relatively simple problems. Colonel Brennan's satisfaction with Jessica's marginalization was evident in his increasingly frequent visits to the administrative offices. He would pause at her desk during facility tours, making pointed comments about the importance of staying within assigned roles and focusing on appropriate responsibilities. "Miss Morgan," he would say, his voice carrying just enough volume to be heard by nearby personnel, "I trust you're finding your current duties manageable. Sometimes we all need reminders about the proper scope of our responsibilities." Jessica's responses remained professionally neutral, but those who understood body language might have noticed subtle signs of the warrior who lay beneath her administrative facade. The slight tension in her shoulders when Brennan approached, the way her fingers would pause over her keyboard for precisely measured intervals, the barely perceptible change in her breathing that suggested someone managing significant stress through disciplined self-control. The colonel's campaign extended beyond professional restrictions to include personal attacks disguised as leadership guidance. During all-hands meetings, he would make general statements about the importance of civilian employees understanding their limitations and working within their capabilities. Comments that everyone present understood were specifically directed at Jessica. "We have excellent civilian employees who handle important administrative functions," Brennan would announce to assembled personnel. "But we must remember that military operations require military experience and military judgment. Good intentions and enthusiasm cannot substitute for proper training and proven competence in life or death situations." These statements were carefully crafted to sound like reasonable leadership philosophy while actually constituting systematic harassment designed to destroy Jessica's credibility and professional standing. The psychological impact was intensified by the fact that she was forced to listen to dismissals of her capabilities from someone whose actual experience was trivial compared to her classified achievements. The breaking point in their conflict came during a high-profile visit from Pentagon officials who were evaluating the wing's test programs for potential budget adjustments. Colonel Brennan had prepared extensively for the inspection, understanding that the officials' recommendations could affect his career prospects and the wing's future operations. The Pentagon delegation included several general officers and senior civilian officials who possessed the kind of security clearances that would have allowed them to recognize Jessica's true background if they had reason to investigate her personnel files. Their visit represented both an opportunity for Brennan to demonstrate his leadership effectiveness and a potential threat to Jessica's anonymity if her expertise became too visible. During the delegation's tour of wing operations, they encountered a technical problem that threatened to embarrass the entire command structure. An experimental aircraft had developed a critical system malfunction that the engineering team couldn't diagnose, and the failure was preventing a scheduled demonstration flight that was central to the inspection visit. Colonel Brennan watched with growing panic as his most experienced personnel struggled with analysis that was beyond their expertise. The Pentagon officials were clearly unimpressed with the wing's ability to handle complex technical problems, and their questions were becoming increasingly pointed about operational readiness and professional competence. From her position in the administrative offices, Jessica could see the computer displays showing the aircraft's diagnostic data. The problem was immediately obvious to someone with her background: a cascade failure in the flight control software that could be corrected through a specific sequence of system resets. The solution would take approximately 15 minutes to implement once the correct procedure was identified. But Colonel Brennan's systematic campaign to marginalize her expertise had created a situation where the one person who could solve the problem was forbidden from participating in its resolution. The irony was lost on everyone except Jessica herself, who watched the wing's reputation suffer because of the colonel's determination to maintain artificial boundaries between civilian and military capabilities. The Pentagon officials departed Edwards with obvious concerns about the wing's technical competence and operational readiness. Their report would likely result in budget reductions, personnel changes, and increased oversight that would affect everyone under Colonel Brennan's command. The failure that could have been prevented by acknowledging Jessica's expertise became a defining moment in the colonel's campaign against her. But what Colonel Brennan didn't understand was that his systematic harassment was being documented by someone who had once briefed intelligence officials on threats to national security. Every restriction, every slight, and every attempt to undermine her credibility was being recorded with the methodical precision that had once characterized her mission planning. The administrative clerk he saw as a problem to be managed was actually gathering evidence for a confrontation that would reveal capabilities he couldn't imagine and consequences he wasn't prepared to face. The emergency began at 13:47 hours on a Tuesday that had started like any other day at Edwards Air Force Base. Captain Michael "Hawk" Thompson was conducting a routine test flight in F-22, a Raptor, serial number 064108, evaluating new software updates for the aircraft's integrated avionics system. The modifications were designed to improve targeting accuracy and reduce pilot workload during complex combat scenarios, representing months of development work by teams of engineers and programmers. Thompson was an experienced test pilot with over 2,000 hours in F-22s, selected for the program because of his ability to provide detailed technical feedback while maintaining precise flight parameters during experimental procedures. The test profile called for a series of high-altitude maneuvers designed to stress the avionics system under conditions that simulated combat operations, pushing both aircraft and pilot to their operational limits. At 45,000 feet above the Mojave Desert, moving at Mach 1.8, Thompson was executing the final phase of the test sequence when multiple warning lights illuminated his cockpit display simultaneously. The primary flight computer crashed without warning, taking with it the fly-by-wire control system that made the F-22 controllable at supersonic speeds. Secondary systems that should have automatically engaged failed to activate, leaving Thompson with an aircraft that was aerodynamically unstable and mechanically unresponsive. Edwards Control, Hawk 1-1 declaring emergency. Thompson transmitted, his voice maintaining professional calm despite the catastrophic nature of his situation. Complete flight control system failure. Aircraft is unresponsive to control. Inputs request immediate emergency landing procedures. In the base control tower, Senior Master Sergeant Rebecca Walsh had been monitoring Thompson's test flight through routine radar tracking and radio communications. The emergency declaration triggered immediate activation of crash response protocols. But the technical nature of the failure was beyond anything covered in standard emergency procedures. An F-22 without functional flight controls was essentially a 65,000-pound projectile following ballistic trajectory toward impact with the desert floor. Hawk 1-1, Edwards Control copies emergency declaration, Walsh responded, her fingers flying across computer keyboards as she activated base-wide. Emergency notifications. Say nature of emergency and pilot intentions. Thompson's situation was becoming more desperate with each passing second. The aircraft was beginning to enter an uncontrolled descent, its nose dropping despite his attempts to maintain level flight through manual control inputs. The F-22's design incorporated inherent instability that required constant computer correction to maintain controlled flight. And without those systems, even the most experienced pilot couldn't prevent an eventual crash. Edwards Control complete. Loss of fly-by-wire systems. The aircraft is entering uncontrolled descent. Estimate 6 minutes until ejection becomes mandatory. Thompson's transmission was interrupted by the sound of warning tones and automated voice alerts that filled his cockpit with urgent advisories about system failures and impending catastrophic situations. The emergency had escalated beyond routine protocols within minutes of Thompson's first distress call. Colonel Brennan arrived in the control tower along with the wing's senior operations staff, technical experts, and emergency response coordinators. The assembled personnel represented decades of combined experience in military aviation, but none had ever faced a situation involving complete flight control failure in an F-22 during supersonic flight. What are options? Colonel Brennan demanded, his voice carrying the authority of command, but also the underlying tension of someone confronting a crisis beyond his experience. Can he regain control of the aircraft? The lead test engineer, Dr. Sarah Kim, was frantically reviewing technical manuals and computer displays that showed Thompson's aircraft systems in real time. Her analysis was grim and straightforward. Sir, without fly-by-wire control, the F-22 is aerodynamically unstable. No pilot can maintain controlled flight manually, especially at supersonic speeds. Captain Thompson needs to eject immediately. But Thompson's situation was more complex than simple pilot survival. His aircraft was following a ballistic trajectory that would bring it down in the populated areas surrounding Edwards Air Force Base. The towns of Rosamond, Mojave, and Lancaster lay directly in the path of his uncontrolled descent, containing over 300,000 residents who had no warning of the approaching danger. Military aircraft crashes in populated areas were rare, but when they occurred, the results were invariably catastrophic. A 65,000-pound F-22 carrying nearly full fuel loads would create an explosion and debris field covering several city blocks. The aircraft's classified systems and weapons components would scatter toxic materials across residential neighborhoods, requiring massive evacuation and cleanup operations that could take years to complete. We need to consider civilian casualties, Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell announced, her combat experience allowing her to quickly assess the broader implications of Thompson's emergency. If he ejects now, that aircraft is going to come down in populated areas. We're looking at hundreds of potential civilian deaths. The control tower erupted in urgent discussions as personnel debated options that ranged from impossible to catastrophic. Fighter aircraft could be scrambled to shoot down the F-22 before it reached populated areas, but the missile engagement would create debris patterns that might actually increase civilian casualties. Ground-based missile systems could attempt intercept, but their accuracy at high altitude was questionable, and the debris problem remained unsolved. Thompson's voice crackled over the radio, with updates that made the situation increasingly desperate. Edwards Control, aircraft altitude 35,000 feet and descending. Rate of descent increasing. Control inputs having minimal effect. Request guidance on civilian evacuation procedures. The mention of civilian evacuation highlighted the impossibility of their situation. Evacuating 300,000 people from multiple towns would require hours that they didn't have, and the panic created by such announcements might cause more casualties than the aircraft crash itself. Emergency coordinators were already calculating response times and evacuation routes, but their preliminary assessments confirmed that meaningful civilian protection was impossible given the time constraints. Jessica Morgan had been monitoring the emergency from her administrative desk through the base-wide communication system that carried all emergency traffic. Her trained ear had immediately recognized the technical nature of Thompson's crisis, and her knowledge of F-22 systems allowed her to understand the implications that others were still struggling to grasp. From her position in Building 47, Jessica could see the emergency vehicles racing across the flight line toward predetermined crash response positions. The activity represented the mobilization of every emergency resource available at Edwards, but she understood that conventional crash response procedures were useless when dealing with an uncontrolled F-22 at supersonic altitude. Her analysis of Thompson's situation was instantaneous and comprehensive. The flight control system failure he was experiencing was a known vulnerability in the F-22 software architecture, one that had been identified during classified testing, but had never been resolved because the specific combination of conditions required to trigger it were considered unlikely to occur during normal operations. Jessica knew the failure mechanism intimately because she had experienced similar situations during experimental flights in modified F-22 variants. The classified procedures for recovering from such failures were not contained in standard pilot training or technical manuals, but were known only to test pilots who had participated in the most advanced development programs. More importantly, Jessica understood that Thompson's aircraft was not actually unrecoverable. The flight control failure created a specific aerodynamic condition that could be corrected through unconventional control inputs, combined with precise manipulation of engine thrust vectors. The recovery procedure required knowledge of classified flight envelope characteristics and piloting techniques that existed nowhere in official documentation. But Jessica's ability to save Thompson and prevent civilian casualties would require her to reveal expertise that could only be explained by her classified background, providing the technical knowledge necessary to guide Thompson through the recovery would instantly expose her true identity to everyone monitoring emergency communications, ending the anonymity she had worked so hard to maintain. Her internal struggle was intensified by the knowledge that Thompson was running out of time. Each passing minute reduced his altitude and increased the difficulty of executing the complex recovery procedure. If she was going to act, the decision had to be made immediately, before the situation progressed beyond the point where even her expertise could prevent disaster. The weight of 300,000 potential civilian casualties pressed against Jessica's commitment to psychological self-preservation. Her oath as a military officer had never been formally terminated, and the responsibility to protect American lives superseded any personal considerations about privacy or anonymity. But the cost of action would be the destruction of the peaceful existence she had built through months of careful reconstruction. In the control tower, desperation was beginning to replace professional composure as personnel realized that conventional solutions were insufficient to prevent catastrophe. Colonel Brennan was demanding options that didn't exist, while technical experts struggled with problems that exceeded their training and experience. The emergency response that should have been routine was revealing dangerous gaps in their preparation for truly unprecedented crises. "Sir, I recommend we order Captain Thompson to eject immediately and initiate civilian evacuation procedures," Dr. Kim announced, her voice reflecting the grim acceptance that they were choosing between different types of disaster rather than preventing catastrophe entirely. Thompson's altitude had dropped to 28,000 feet, and his rate of descent was increasing as the aircraft's inherent instability began to overcome his attempts at manual control. His training told him that ejection was the only rational choice, but his knowledge of the civilian population below created a moral dilemma that transcended pilot survival instincts. Edwards Control recommend you contact the Classified Flight Test Division, Thompson transmitted, his voice strained by the physical effort of wrestling with unresponsive flight controls. This failure mode might be covered under experimental procedures. Someone might know recovery techniques that aren't in standard manuals. His suggestion triggered frantic communications with classified test programs, but the personnel with relevant knowledge were either unavailable or lacked security clearances that would allow them to discuss experimental procedures over unsecured RADIO channels. The compartmentalized nature of classified programs that protected national security was now preventing the sharing of information that could save lives. Jessica's decision crystallized as she realized that Thompson's suggestion had inadvertently provided her with the perfect opportunity to act without revealing her complete background. She could contact the control tower as a civilian employee who had access to classified technical databases, providing just enough information to guide Thompson through the recovery without exposing the full extent of her pilot expertise. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the secure telephone that connected Building 47 to the control tower. The call would begin a sequence of events that would inevitably lead to questions about her background and capabilities, but the alternative was allowing hundreds of innocent people to die because she was unwilling to risk her anonymity. Edwards Control, this is Jessica Morgan in Building 47 Administrative Offices, she said when the call connected. I have access to classified F-22 technical databases. I may have information relevant to Captain Thompson's emergency. The response was immediate and desperate. Miss Morgan, this is Colonel Brennan. What information do you have? Jessica's voice carried the calm authority that had once characterized her most dangerous missions. Sir, the failure mode Captain Thompson is experiencing is covered under classified test procedures. There is a recovery technique, but it requires precise execution of unconventional control inputs. I can provide technical guidance if you'll patch me through to the pilot. The silence that followed her offer was filled with the weight of decisions that would affect hundreds of thousands of lives. In that moment, Jessica Morgan ceased being a dismissed administrative clerk and began the transformation back into the warrior who had once been considered the most dangerous pilot in American military history. Colonel Brennan's response would determine whether Thompson lived or died, whether 300,000 civilians faced catastrophe or safety, and whether Jessica's carefully constructed anonymity would survive the crisis that was about to test every skill she had ever developed. The desk clerk was about to become a weapon, and the man who had systematically dismissed her capabilities was about to discover what it meant to underestimate someone who had learned to fight from the shadows. Patch me through to Captain Thompson. Immediately, Jessica's voice cut through the chaos in the control tower with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to life or death command decisions. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. The hesitant administrative clerk who had endured months of systematic dismissal was gone, replaced by a warrior whose very presence radiated the kind of competence that could only be forged in the crucible of combat experience. Colonel Brennan stared at her through the secure video connection that had been hastily established between Building 47 and the control tower. Something fundamental had changed in Jessica's demeanor, her posture, even her breathing patterns. The woman who had meekly accepted his harassment was speaking with the calm precision of someone who had faced far more dangerous situations than a single aircraft emergency. Miss Morgan, are you certain you can help? Brennan asked, his voice carrying uncertainty that reflected his growing realization that he might have fundamentally misjudged the person he had been systematically marginalizing. "Colonel, Captain Thompson has approximately 3 minutes before his aircraft becomes unrecoverable," Jessica replied, her tone brooking no argument or delay. "Every second we waste on questions is a second closer to 300,000 civilian casualties. Patch me through now." The radio connection crackled to life as Thompson's desperate voice filled the control tower. "Edwards control, altitude 22,000 feet and descending rapidly. The aircraft is completely unresponsive to normal control inputs. Request immediate guidance or I'm ejecting in 60 seconds. Jessica's voice, transmitted through the emergency communication system, reached Thompson with the clarity and authority that had once guided dozens of pilots through impossible combat situations. "Captain Thompson, this is Jessica Morgan. I have specific technical knowledge of your failure mode. Are you prepared to attempt an unconventional recovery procedure?" Thompson's response was immediate. "Morgan, I'll try anything. This bird is going down hard if we don't do something." "Roger, Captain." "Your flight control failure is a software cascade triggered by specific sensor conflicts. The recovery requires manual override of automatic systems combined with precise thrust vectoring. Do you copy?" "Copy, Morgan." "What's the procedure?" Jessica's instructions began with the methodical precision that had characterized her most complex experimental flights. Her knowledge of the F-22's classified systems was encyclopedic, and her understanding of the specific failure mode came from personal experience during test flights that had never been officially acknowledged. First, you need to disengage all automatic flight systems through the emergency disconnect sequence. This will give you direct control of engine thrust vectors, but it will also eliminate all computer-assisted stability. The aircraft will become more unstable initially, but it will also become responsive to unconventional control inputs. In the control tower, the assembled personnel listened in stunned silence as Jessica guided Thompson through procedures that appeared nowhere in official technical manuals. Dr. Kim frantically searched through classified databases, trying to verify the instructions being given by a civilian administrative employee who somehow possessed knowledge that exceeded her own expertise. "Morgan, I've disengaged automatic systems," Thompson reported. "Aircraft is more unstable now, but I'm getting some response from control inputs. What's next?" "You're going to use differential thrust to control pitch and yaw while using control surfaces for roll stabilization. This is the critical part. You need to establish a controlled descent profile that will allow recovery to level flight. Your target descent rate is 500 feet per minute with a slight nose-up attitude." Thompson's aircraft was now at 18,000 feet, still descending but in a more controlled manner as Jessica's instructions began to take effect. The recovery procedure required split-second timing and precise coordination between multiple control systems, demanding piloting skills that went far beyond conventional training. "I need you to gradually increase thrust on the right engine while decreasing thrust on the left," Jessica continued. "This will create a controlled roll that you can counter with left aileron input. The goal is to establish a spiral descent that bleeds off speed while maintaining control authority." Colonel Brennan watched in amazement as Jessica orchestrated the recovery with expertise that suggested experience far beyond anything in her personnel file. Her understanding of F-22 systems was not theoretical knowledge gained from technical manuals, but practical expertise that could only come from extensive flight experience in the aircraft itself. "Morgan, how do you know these procedures?" Thompson asked over the radio, his voice reflecting the same confusion that was visible on every face in the control tower. Jessica's response was carefully measured, revealing just enough to maintain credibility without exposing her complete background. "I have access to classified test data that documents the specific failure mode. The recovery procedures were developed during experimental flight testing, but they've never been incorporated into standard training programs. The partial truth satisfied Thompson's immediate need for confidence in the instructions he was receiving, but it raised additional questions among the control tower personnel, who were beginning to understand that they were witnessing capabilities that defied explanation through conventional channels. Altitude 15,000 feet, Thompson reported. Descent rate is stabilizing around 600 feet per minute. Aircraft is responding to control inputs, but it's requiring constant correction to maintain. Attitude. Excellent, Captain. Now comes the difficult part. You need to transition from controlled descent to level flight without triggering another control system failure. This requires a specific sequence of power changes coordinated with control surface inputs. Jessica's instructions became increasingly complex as she guided Thompson through the final phase of the recovery. The procedure required him to manipulate engine thrust, control surfaces, and aircraft attitude with a precision that pushed human capability to its absolute limits. Her knowledge of the exact parameters necessary for success could only have come from personal experience executing similar recoveries under actual flight conditions. Reduce power on both engines to 75% while applying forward pressure on the stick. You want to achieve a slight nose-down attitude that will arrest the descent rate without triggering speed warnings. As you approach level flight, gradually increase power while easing back pressure. The tension in the control tower was palpable. As everyone watched radar displays showing Thompson's aircraft gradually transitioning from uncontrolled descent to stable flight. The recovery was proceeding exactly as Jessica had predicted, but the complexity of the procedure made it clear that her knowledge came from sources that extended far beyond administrative access to technical databases. "Morgan, I've got level flight," Thompson announced, his voice filled with relief and amazement. "The aircraft is stable at 12,000 feet. How did you know that would work?" Jessica's response carried undertones that suggested depths of experience that nobody in the control tower could fully comprehend. "The recovery procedure has been proven effective during classified testing. Your situation was dangerous, but not unprecedented." Colonel Brennan's realization that he had been systematically harassing someone with extraordinary capabilities was beginning to sink in as he watched Jessica coordinate Thompson's approach to Edwards for an emergency landing. Her instructions for the final approach phase demonstrated knowledge of runway conditions, emergency procedures, and aircraft limitations that exceeded the expertise of most operational pilots. "Captain Thompson, your emergency approach will require non-standard procedures because your flight control systems are still partially degraded," Jessica continued. "You'll need to maintain higher than normal approach speeds and use engine thrust for precise altitude control. Your landing distance will be approximately twice normal parameters." The emergency landing that followed was a masterpiece of precision. Flying guided by expertise that combined theoretical knowledge with practical experience. Thompson's approach was executed with the kind of perfection that demonstrated the quality of instruction he was receiving from someone who understood every nuance of F-22 performance characteristics. "Touchdown confirmed," the control tower announced. As Thompson's aircraft made contact with the runway in a landing that appeared routine despite the extraordinary circumstances that had preceded it. "Emergency response teams are standing by. Pilot reports aircraft secure and no injuries." The silence that followed Thompson's successful landing was filled with questions that nobody knew how to ask. Jessica Morgan, the administrative clerk, who had been dismissed as worthless by Colonel Brennan, had just executed one of the most complex aircraft recoveries in military aviation history. Her knowledge and expertise had saved not only Thompson's life, but potentially hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties. Colonel Brennan's voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of someone grappling with the complete collapse of his assumptions about competence, authority, and military hierarchy. "Miss Morgan, I think we need to have a conversation about your background and qualifications." Jessica's response was delivered with the calm satisfaction of someone who had just proven a point that had been years in the making. "Colonel, I think we need to have a conversation about your judgment and leadership capabilities. You've spent months trying to marginalize someone whose expertise far exceeds your own, and in the process, you've created institutional vulnerabilities that could have cost hundreds of thousands of lives." The confrontation that had been building for months was finally taking place, but the power dynamic had been completely reversed. Jessica was no longer the dismissed administrative employee seeking validation from military authority. She was a proven expert whose capabilities had been demonstrated under the most demanding circumstances possible. "How did you acquire such detailed knowledge of F-22 systems?" Brennan asked, his voice reflecting the desperate need to understand how completely he had misjudged the situation. "That's classified information, Colonel," Jessica replied, using the same dismissive tone that Brennan had employed against her for months. "What matters is that your systematic campaign to marginalize my contributions nearly resulted in a catastrophic failure of this wing's emergency response capabilities. Captain Thompson is alive, and 300,000 civilians are safe, not because of your leadership, but despite your interference." The other personnel in the control tower watched the exchange with fascination and growing understanding that they were witnessing a reckoning that went far beyond the immediate aircraft emergency. The woman they had overlooked was revealing herself as someone whose true capabilities had been hidden behind a facade of administrative mediocrity. Dr. Kim, who had been frantically searching classified databases during the emergency, finally located documentation that confirmed Jessica's instructions. "Colonel, the recovery procedures she provided are accurate. They're contained in classified test reports that require special access authorization. I don't understand how a civilian administrative employee would have knowledge of such material." Jessica's smile carried the satisfaction of someone who had just won a battle that others were only beginning to understand had been fought. "Dr. Kim, you might want to expand your database searches to include personnel records with higher classification levels. You might find some interesting information about the qualifications of people you've been overlooking." The implications of Jessica's statement began to penetrate the consciousness of everyone present. Her knowledge of classified procedures, her expertise in F-22 systems, and her ability to guide a pilot through impossible recovery maneuvers suggested a background that went far beyond anything in her official personnel file. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, whose combat experience allowed her to recognize competence when she saw it, was the first to voice what everyone was beginning to suspect. "Miss Morgan, your knowledge and expertise suggest flight experience in F-22 aircraft. That's not something that can be acquired through administrative access to technical databases." Jessica's response confirmed what Mitchell had already deduced. "You're correct, Colonel Mitchell. My knowledge comes from practical experience, not theoretical study. Perhaps Colonel Brennan should have investigated my background more thoroughly before deciding that I was worthless." The transformation was complete. Jessica Morgan was no longer hiding behind the facade of administrative mediocrity. The warrior who had once been considered the most dangerous pilot in American military history had revealed herself, and the people who had dismissed her capabilities were beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake. Colonel Brennan faced a choice that would define the remainder of his career. He could acknowledge his errors and attempt to rebuild his credibility, or he could continue his campaign against someone who had just demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything in his experience. The wrong choice would destroy not only his career, but his reputation as a military leader. The woman he had called worthless had just saved 300 lives through skills that represented the pinnacle of military aviation expertise. The desk clerk he had systematically marginalized was actually a weapon of unprecedented capability, and the confrontation that followed would determine whether his leadership could survive the exposure of his fundamental misjudgment about the people under his command. The Pentagon's response to Captain Thompson's miraculous recovery was swift and unprecedented. Within 6 hours of his emergency landing, a team of investigators from the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the Office of the Secretary of Defense had arrived at Edwards Air Force Base with classified authorizations that granted them access to personnel records at the highest security levels. The investigation that followed would ultimately reshape military personnel policies across all branches of the armed forces. But its immediate focus was understanding how a civilian, administrative employee had possessed the classified knowledge necessary to execute one of the most complex aircraft recoveries in aviation history. The implications for national security were staggering if Jessica Morgan's background had been compromised, or if her expertise indicated unauthorized access to classified information. The consequences could affect programs worth billions of dollars and operations spanning multiple continents. General Patricia Hawkins, the 3-star Air Force officer who led the investigation team, had spent her career managing the most sensitive aspects of military aviation development. Her security clearance granted access to programs that existed nowhere in public records, and her first action upon arriving at Edwards was to request Jessica's complete personnel file from databases that required special authorization to access. What General Hawkins discovered in those classified files fundamentally altered her understanding of the situation at Edwards. Jessica "Ghost" Morgan's true identity was known to fewer than a dozen officials in the entire Pentagon, and her classified service record contained achievements that exceeded anything in the general's extensive experience with elite military personnel. Colonel Brennan, General Hawkins announced during an emergency briefing in the wing commander's office, "You've been systematically harassing one of the most accomplished test pilots in Air Force history." Her classified service record includes achievements that are literally unprecedented in military aviation. The general's words hit Colonel Brennan with the force of a physical blow. The woman he had dismissed as worthless possessed credentials that exceeded his own by margins that rendered his career accomplishments trivial by comparison. His systematic campaign to marginalize her contributions was not just morally wrong, it was strategically catastrophic for American military capabilities. "General, I had no knowledge of Miss Morgan's background," Brennan stammered, his voice reflecting the desperate attempt to salvage a career that was disintegrating in real time. Her personnel file showed only civilian administrative experience. "General." Hawkins' response was delivered with the icy precision that had made her legendary among Pentagon officials. "Colonel, your ignorance of her background is exactly the problem. You made fundamental decisions about personnel management without conducting the basic investigations that any competent commander would have performed. Your actions nearly resulted in the loss of one of our most valuable military assets." The classified briefing that followed revealed the full scope of Jessica's achievements during her service in the Nighthawk program. Her development of unconventional flight techniques, her contributions to experimental aircraft design, and her role in missions that had affected international security were documented in files that carried classification levels, requiring special congressional oversight. "Colonel." Brennan listened in stunned silence as General Hawkins described achievements that placed Jessica among the most accomplished military aviators in American history. The woman he had relegated to processing routine paperwork had once commanded aircraft worth more than the entire annual budget of most military installations. "Colonel." Captain Morgan's expertise in F-22 systems comes from her role as the primary test pilot for experimental variants that incorporated technologies decades ahead of current operational aircraft, General Hawkins continued. Her knowledge of recovery procedures saved Captain Thompson's life because she personally developed those procedures during classified test flights that pushed F-22 capabilities beyond manufacturer specifications. The revelation that Jessica had personally developed the recovery techniques she had used to save Thompson created a moment of profound understanding for everyone present. Her instructions hadn't come from technical manuals or database access. They had come from personal experience executing similar recoveries under actual flight conditions during some of the most dangerous test flights in military history. Dr. Kim, who had struggled to locate documentation of the recovery procedures during the emergency, now understood why her database searches had been unsuccessful. The techniques Jessica had employed were not documented in standard technical literature because they had been developed during classified programs that existed outside normal military documentation systems. General, what are the implications for wing operations going forward? Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell asked, her combat experience allowing her to recognize that the situation required immediate strategic adjustments. General, Hawkins' response outlined changes that would fundamentally alter the culture and operational procedures at Edwards. Effective immediately, Captain Morgan will be restored to active duty with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel and assigned as Deputy Wing Commander for test operations. Her expertise will be formally integrated into all experimental flight programs, and her previous service record will be partially declassified to ensure proper recognition of her capabilities. The transformation of Jessica's status from dismissed administrative clerk to senior military officer was accomplished through executive orders that bypassed normal bureaucratic procedures. Her psychological evaluation had been updated to reflect her successful reintegration into operational responsibilities, and her security clearances were restored to levels that granted access to the most sensitive military programs. But the most significant change was the establishment of new personnel protection protocols designed to prevent future situations where valuable military assets could be marginalized through institutional ignorance or systematic harassment. The Morgan Protocol, as it came to be known, required comprehensive background investigations for all personnel whose expertise might be relevant to mission-critical operations. Colonel Brennan's career effectively ended the day General Hawkins completed her investigation. His systematic harassment of a national security asset, combined with his failure to properly investigate the capabilities of personnel under his command, resulted in immediate reassignment to a staff position that effectively terminated his advancement prospects. The final confrontation between Brennan and Jessica took place in the wing commander's office, with General Hawkins present as an official witness. The meeting was designed to provide closure for both parties while establishing clear expectations for future professional conduct. Colonel Brennan, Jessica said, her voice carrying the authority that came from proven competence and official recognition. Your campaign against me was based on assumptions that reflected your own limitations rather than mine. You saw competence as a threat rather than an asset, and in the process, you created vulnerabilities that could have cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Brennan's response reflected the complete collapse of his previous certainty about military hierarchy and personnel management. Lieutenant Colonel Morgan, I was wrong about your capabilities and your value to this organization. My actions were inexcusable, and I accept full responsibility for the consequences. The apology was necessary but insufficient to repair the damage that had been done to wing operations and personnel morale. Jessica's expertise had been deliberately suppressed for months, preventing improvements to safety procedures and operational efficiency that could have benefited the entire test wing. Colonel, your mistake wasn't just personal, it was institutional. Jessica replied, you created an environment where expertise was dismissed based on rank and position rather than evaluated based on merit. The changes being implemented will ensure that future commanders don't repeat your errors. The broader implications of Jessica's case extended far beyond Edwards Air Force Base to influence military culture across all services. Her experience became a case study in leadership schools, demonstrating how institutional prejudices could compromise national security by preventing the identification and utilization of exceptional capabilities. The documentary film that chronicled Jessica's story became required viewing for senior military officers and was translated into multiple languages for use by allied military organizations. Her experience provided a powerful example of how hidden expertise could exist within military organizations and how leadership failures could prevent that expertise from being utilized effectively. Jessica's new role as Deputy Wing Commander allowed her to implement changes that had been impossible during her administrative exile. Safety procedures were updated to reflect her experimental flight experience. Training programs were enhanced with techniques she had developed during classified operations, and personnel evaluation systems were modified to identify hidden capabilities that might otherwise be overlooked. The F-22 squadron that had benefited from her life-saving expertise became a laboratory for testing new approaches to pilot training and aircraft operations. Her knowledge of experimental systems and unconventional flight techniques was formally incorporated into training curricula, ensuring that future pilots would have access to expertise that had previously been limited to classified programs. Captain Thompson, whose life had been saved through Jessica's intervention, became one of her strongest advocates for institutional reform. His testimony about the recovery procedure she had provided was instrumental in convincing Pentagon officials that traditional approaches to personnel management were inadequate for identifying and protecting valuable military assets. Lieutenant Colonel Morgan didn't just save my life, Thompson told congressional investigators during hearings about military personnel policies. She demonstrated that our most valuable people might be hiding in plain sight, dismissed by leaders who lack the wisdom to recognize expertise when they see it. The mentorship program that Jessica established for military personnel transitioning between operational and administrative roles became a model for other installations. Her experience of being systematically marginalized while possessing extraordinary capabilities provided unique insights into the psychological challenges faced by personnel whose expertise was undervalued or misunderstood. The research projects that emerged from her case advanced understanding of military culture, organizational behavior, and personnel management in ways that influenced policies across multiple government agencies. Her experience became a foundational example of how individual competence could be suppressed by institutional failures and how organizational changes could prevent similar problems in the future. 5 years after Captain Thompson's emergency landing, Jessica Morgan stood before the Senate Armed Services Committee, delivering testimony that would influence military personnel policies for decades to come. Her transformation from dismissed administrative clerk to nationally recognized expert had become a symbol of hidden potential and the importance of creating systems that could identify and protect valuable capabilities, regardless of their apparent context. Senators, Jessica announced to the assembled committee, "My case demonstrates that our most dangerous enemies are not always foreign adversaries with sophisticated weapon systems. Sometimes our greatest threat is the institutional ignorance that prevents us from recognizing and utilizing the extraordinary people who have chosen to serve their country in whatever capacity circumstances require." The committee's questions focused on the systemic changes needed to prevent future situations where valuable military assets could be marginalized through leadership failures or organizational prejudices. Jessica's responses provided a comprehensive framework for understanding how traditional military hierarchies could be adapted to identify and protect hidden expertise. "The lesson of my experience is not that exceptional people should be given special treatment," Jessica explained. "The lesson is that every person in military service deserves evaluation based on their actual capabilities rather than assumptions about their limitations. Excellence can emerge from the most unexpected places, and our institutional systems must be designed to recognize and nurture that excellence regardless of rank, position, or apparent status." The Morgan Institute for Military Excellence, established at the Air Force Academy, became the permanent repository for lessons learned from her case. The Institute's research focused on developing leadership practices that could maximize human potential while preventing the kind of systematic marginalization that had characterized her experience at Edwards. Jessica's influence on military aviation was reflected in the safety improvements and operational enhancements that resulted from incorporating her expertise into standard procedures. Accident rates decreased, training effectiveness improved, and pilot confidence increased as her innovations were adopted throughout the Air Force. But perhaps the most significant impact of her case was the cultural transformation it inspired within military organizations. The recognition that extraordinary capabilities might be hidden within seemingly ordinary roles led to more sophisticated approaches to talent identification and development that benefited countless military personnel who might otherwise have been overlooked. The woman who had been called worthless had proven that true value often exists in the most unexpected places. Her story became a reminder that heroes come in many forms, and that the quiet strength of those who choose to serve in silence often represents the most powerful force for positive change. Lieutenant Colonel Jessica "Ghost" Morgan had saved 300 lives with an impossible F-22 landing. But her greatest achievement was demonstrating that the most dangerous weapons in democracy's arsenal are not the aircraft on the flight line, but the dedication, courage, and hidden expertise of those who refuse to be broken by ignorance and who choose to serve their country, regardless of whether their contributions are recognized or appreciated. The Ghost had finally stepped into the light, and her influence would continue to protect and inspire future generations of warriors who understood that true strength often comes from the most unexpected sources. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.